If someone had their hands or ligature around your neck and they were making an attempt or actually depriving your brain of the necessary oxygen for you to be alive, would you have the right to use deadly force to save your life? I've never had anybody say no. It actually takes less pounds of pressure to close off a jugular vein and a carotid artery than to open a can of soda. And many of us do that every day. Every moment that your brain is unconscious, hundreds of millions of neurons and synapses have died in your brain. Statistics tell us that only about 3% of strangled victims get medical care.
Hello, 7 on Sundays listeners. I am so happy for the conversation that you're about to hear, not because the content is, something that you're going to feel good about. In fact, it's a little scary. We're going to talk about strangulation. We're going to talk about strangulation in domestic violence situations as well as sexual strangulation. And we are joined by an amazing guest, Brian Bennett, who is a 26-year retired veteran of the South Carolina Police Force and a 16-year instructor at the police academy. He is sought out as an expert in cases where strangulation is part of the case. And what I think is really interesting, I do say it in the interview, but I want to just quickly reiterate that sexual strangulation is an area that is relatively new. And it is something that we don't have a lot of language around. We don't have a lot of understanding around. We think that it's this carefree activity. And you will hear from Brian Bennett that it is not as carefree and it has long-term impacts. And I want people to really hear and to know that this is an evolving area that needs research, that needs people who are taking care of young people to understand well so that they can advise them and they can share with them the dangers that they put themselves in when they decide to let their partner strangle them in a sexual situation. So, very excited to talk to Brian Bennett.
We are not going to have a wrap up for this interview. It is very full and very informative, and we covered a lot today. Let's jump right in. Thank you and welcome to the show, Brian.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity and the interest in what I believe is a very much underreported and undercovered type of topic. I am recently retired from state law enforcement in South Carolina. I've got a combination of local, state, and federal service that encompasses about 26 and a half years. For the last 16 years of my career, I taught full-time at our state police academy, specializing in domestic violence, vulnerable adult and elder abuse, and since 2015, specializing in non-fatal strangulation. During my career, I've had the pleasure of attending many different types of schools of all different disciplines, about 35 or 40 different schools. One of those that I'm most proud about is I went through the sexual assault nurse examiner school, or what they call forensic nurse examiner school. I went through the didactic program, and what that means is I went through the academic portion of that training. I couldn't do the practical exams because I'm not a registered nurse, but to get more understanding and more insight into not just this strangulation issue, but sexual assault is why I went through that, just to make myself more informed as an officer with those type of issues. And again, during that time, I've served on a governor's domestic violence task force as a co-chairman of a domestic violence division. I've given testimony to our legislature, to our attorney general, provided advice and direction with different laws, one that currently is in the works. I regularly take continuing education and advanced courses in strangulation awareness, detection, and treatment. And then I pass on that information to other professionals, not just law enforcement, but I've taught coroners, medical examiners, prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, law enforcement, paramedics. So a very diverse group of audiences that all have the opportunity to intersect with this topic that we're going to cover today, but also have to give credit to people who've taught me. And so the Institute on Strangulation Prevention out of California have made themselves available to me. And I've been trained by some of the most known forensic pathologists and doctors in the United States, and who have had some international recognition as specialists in non-fatal strangulation. So I feel that I'm very fortunate and blessed to have had the benefit of their knowledge and their training and being able to pass it on to a wider broader audience. So again, thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, of course. I think when you say non-fatal strangulation, is non-fatal strangulation, in your experience, mostly in domestic violence situations? Obviously, we talk on this podcast about young people who are, using sexual strangulation as a form of arousal or to increase arousal. Do you see both when you're talking non-fatal strangulation?
Yes. So where this emphasis and focus nationally on strangulation issues came about was within the realm of domestic violence. That about 20 years ago is when there was a very intentional focus on this being a common factor with domestic violence. And it started in California 20 years ago in research going from West Coast to East Coast, both academic research, victim service research, federal grant program research, kind of all was that basis of domestic violence. But what we have come to learn is that this mechanism and this type of assault strangulation is used in a much broader way outside the domestic or familial intimate relationship. And we see it now emphasized in, of course, sexual assault. We see it in human trafficking, kidnappings. We see it in vulnerable adult and elder abuse, and even in child abuse. So it's become much broader than we ever thought before, but that's because research has been focused into areas, and truly we've followed the breadcrumbs. We've listened to accounts of people and their personal experiences within different victim typologies, and we've seen this consistent thread of strangulation being used. So yeah, I definitely see domestic violence for sure, but we've also seen marked increase over other victim types.
I have a question, Brian, about the awareness detection and who you work with and train. Do you, because I'm a marriage and family therapist, do you also work with counselors, therapists, and doctors to train them what to look for?
Yeah, so more directly, I've worked with the medical profession, those that would be in a clinical setting, providing medical triage at emergency centers or urgent cares. I haven't had much of the opportunity to work within the sociology, the psychology, and therapeutic practices that are available for relationships and that sort of thing. With respect to our state in South Carolina, I think that door will open up once, hopefully, we pass the legislation and a very specific defined statute in South Carolina. I think that the statute will necessitate an awareness of something that right now many people are not aware of, even within that therapeutic realm. And again, I have to speak within South Carolina because I know in other states it's quite different, where statutes and processes and protocols have been put in place for different types of professions, and we just don't have that here yet. But I've always been open to that opportunity because, again, when we're talking about sexual assault or domestic violence or any form of abuse, we know that these, what I call victim survivors of these type of instances, don't always report to law enforcement. Quite frankly, they talk to their friends, their family, if they talk at all. They might talk to their therapist, they talk to their hairdresser, they talk to their pastor. And so there's a lot of people that need to know this information because of the opportunity that these conversations or these disclosures are going to be made.
Right. And the lines get so blurred with this sexual asphyxiation and the confusion of, what is it?
I think it's important that maybe we talk about, like, what are some of those signs of, you know, well, whether non-fatal strangulation. Let's talk about them, just like, what is it that you're teaching other law enforcement people, doctors, things like that, about sexual strangulation that the general population would benefit from learning?
One of the big misconceptions and misinformation that was promoted 20 years ago, and still to some degree is promoted, that is, if someone is strangled, they're going to have marks on them. We're going to see something externally on their body. And the fact of the matter is that even in fatal strangulations, only about 50% of victims are going to have any external mark on their body. So if we're relying on our eyes to give us indications of strangulation, we're missing 50% of them because we just can't see the external injuries.
And those external marks would be bruising on the neck or the hemorrhaging in the eyes. Are there other signs that are common that people look for?
Those are going to be the two most common is some type of bruising or abrasions or marks on the neck. Now that can come from the aggressor, but that can also come from the victim survivor. I mean, if somebody has a ligature hands around your neck and you don't have the ability with your power to pull their hands off, you're going to try to get your hands underneath theirs. And a lot of times the scrapes and abrasions are from victims clawing at their own neck to get behind that constriction. So again, injuries around the neck area, the hemorrhaging in the eyes, what we call the petechial hemorrhages, was another kind of suggested clue that someone was strangled. However, what we know now is that those petechial hemorrhages can appear in many different places, not just the eyes, but they can also occur in areas that aren't readily seen. For example, under and behind the eyelid, so you might not see it in the white of the eye, but you may see it when the eyelid is pulled down or pulled up. Those petechial hemorrhages can also occur inside the mouth, in the back of the throat, inside the ear, around the ear, on the surface of the skin of the face, on the scalp alone. And sometimes those petechial hemorrhages are only observable on the brain during an MRI scan.
Wow.
Another interesting thing about petechial hemorrhages is a certain mechanism of strangulation has to happen to create a petechial hemorrhage. Maybe we get into it later, but if the mechanism of strangulation is slightly different, petechial hemorrhages won't even develop. It's not a 100% guarantee.
I'm just curious if somebody is, again, we're going to talk about domestic violence because we've had guests on who experienced domestic violence. We're also going to talk about sexual strangulation because it is such a popular sexual activity, if you will. But if, let's just say, we're talking in a sexual play type way, if you actually are seeing bruising here or the hemorrhaging in the eyes,
Mhm.
that has to mean that you've gone a little beyond the light hold on someone's neck, right? Like that doesn't happen easily. That's not what's in a light, playful way, I
Yeah,
imagine.
it certainly indicates there's a possible high level of pressure, but it can but and this is where again training comes into play. It doesn't take a lot of pressure to actually create petechial hemorrhages. Now, to cause bruising on the surface of the skin, or what we call subcutaneous bruising that is under the skin, yeah, you're gonna be looking at more significant pressure, and also when a ligature is used. So a ligature, which is anything other than the human body. I mean, it could be a USB power cord, it could be a scarf, it could be an article of clothing. You look at pressure, you look at surface area, and you look at duration. And so a ligature focuses pressure in a very specific area, and duration wise, it may only last a couple of seconds, but because the pressure was so focused in a smaller area, it may leave a telltale sign of a ligature mark. But we also know with something larger than a ligature, like a hand or a forearm, or being pressed and having someone's neck occluded but between another person's legs, well, our hands and our body are much larger surface areas, so the pressure is not focused as much, but it might be for a longer duration that creates that bruising that we see. When I say pressures, we have to relate it to something. So, for example, it only takes about 4.5 to 5 pounds of pressure per square inch to close off your carotid artery. That is not a lot of pressure. It takes about 11 pounds of pressure to close off your jugular vein, and it takes about 33 pounds of pressure to close off your trachea. And people say, well, can you give me an understanding of, comparatively what 5 pounds of pressure, 11? Well, it takes about 20 pounds of pressure to open a can of soda. So it actually takes less pounds of pressure to close off a jugular vein and a carotid artery than to open a can of soda. And many of us do that every day. And we like, wow, wow. So when you understand that the amount of pressure that's actually needed to kill somebody and to render them unconscious is between 35 and 33 pounds. You can understand why, in a lot of cases, there are no external injuries, or the external injuries are not as pronounced as we would expect them to be. Another couple comparative examples is the trigger pull on a pistol. Most law enforcement duty pistols, it's only 5 pounds of pressure to pull the trigger on that pistol. Many of us carry groceries from our car to our house, loaded up. I mean, we're sometimes carrying 30, 40, 50 pounds. Now, that's not pounds of pressure per square inch. That's just straight pounds. But when you look at how those garbage bags, or not garbage bags, but shopping bags are pressed into our forearms and our hands, you're talking about, sometimes hundreds of pounds of pressure per square inch, but it doesn't feel like that.
Mm.
So, yeah, again, pressure and duration have a lot to do with people being unconscious and or suffering, or what we see as external marks and injuries.
I was wondering, Brian, that's fascinating and so scary, really. But I was wondering, out there in my realm, there's a lot of internet teachings on everything from eating disorder, the skinny things and suicide options and all those kind of things. Are you guys, and I know that there's different groups that are shutting those down, but are you guys seeing things on the internet about how to strangle somebody, quote unquote, safely, and or kind of promoting this in terms of a teaching, like not just what people might see on, a pornographic site, but
Right.
in terms of actually teaching?
Yeah. I would say right now within the law enforcement community, I don't see them right now emphasizing very much that research, or tracking that down to see where these behaviors come from and where this education has come from. I know anecdotally, and talking to different investigators and law enforcement here and around the country, they hear stories from the people that have survived. They sometimes, during the criminal interviews, hear stories from our offenders as to how they were taught, or how they learned, or how they came to have an awareness. But specifically, law enforcement digging into the dark web, or just what's out there for everyone to see, I don't see that happening very much. Now, to be fair, I've never been part of an internet crimes task force, but I do know officers that are part of what we call our internet crimes against children task forces, that are very deep into the dark web and researching images and videos for not just criminal activity, but causative factors. And again, anecdotally, they tell me that they have seen some of these things, but as to what I've seen thus far, I haven't seen any large established studies or research specifically focusing on where this knowledge and information is coming from. I think there is perhaps an estimation or a guess that it's being passed person to person. But as you correctly stated, we know that there are people out there who are, thinking this is okay, and there are better ways to do it. And to your point, there is no safe way to strangle anybody. It doesn't exist. Although it may be promoted as such, they're operating in ignorance without a true understanding of just how dangerous it is. And therein lies one of the deepest problems that we face, is people thinking this is normalized and it's safe, and it's not.
Brian, do you want to tell us what is the fallout of strangulation for somebody who has experienced non-fatal strangulation? We'll look at that, and then we'll look at, are they creating public awareness about these things?
Sure, sure. So again, the foundation and basis of all this knowledge to begin with started with domestic violence. And what research has shown us is that a woman, and it's almost predominantly a woman, we know that in same-sex relationships this does occur, but within the heterosexual community, most of the research is based in the heterosexual relationships, that a woman that survives one non-fatal strangulation event is at an 800% increase of being killed later. And so that is telling us that strangulation within the domestic violence realm of intentional violence and intentional abuse is the number one indicator of a future homicide. Now, that future homicide usually comes by way of a firearm. There's some varying statistics out there, but most of them kind of fall around 70 to 77% that your domestic homicides that are firearms related had a prior history of non-fatal strangulation. The other thing too is that within the realm of domestic violence is it's not just a matter of finality, but it's also a matter of medical triage as well. When someone in a domestic relationship is strangled, again, that points to that if there's not some type of intervention, there will likely be some type of homicide later. But it doesn't they don't get the medical triage that they need. There are over 25 medical complications associated with being strangled. Many of those complications are acute and potentially lethal even months after the strangulation. And even if they aren't lethal, they often lead to some type of permanent, long lasting injury or deficiency in the way that person's body operates, either cognitively or physiologically. And we've seen that as well.
That is really important for people to hear, that this is long term. Short term, you had said, short term, you may not even know you have an issue. Maybe you can tell us about that. Maybe you can tell some of the 25 identified like issues that come from strangulation. And again, we're talking either sexual or domestic violence because it just depends on how much. I just read a story in The Guardian where a girl liked a lot of pressure around her neck. What is she potentially going to experience later on in her life?
Within that danger realm, some of the well, we talked already about the external injuries. Here's the interesting thing about external injuries. They're more prominent but less frequent. What is more frequent but less prominent are the subtle signs and symptoms of internal injury. So, some subtle signs of internal injury is trouble speaking. About 50% of the time, there's going to be some altered voice due to nerve or physiological damage to the vocal cords, and that may be permanent or temporary. Difficulty swallowing, difficulty breathing, urinary and bowel incontinence, altered states of memory or loss of consciousness. Sometimes vomiting takes place, and that's that is a possible indicator. It's not proof, but those are some of the more common. And of course, hurting in areas. Somebody indicating, I mean, having a headache, holding their neck, that sort of thing. But some of the more acute and dangerous symptoms of being strangled, one is called what's called carotid dissection. Now, carotid dissection is just what it sounds like. It is where the carotid artery has been torn or damaged during the strangulation event. And someone this could happen and someone can't feel it. They don't know it. What's so dangerous about this? It's not that the carotid artery completely tears and we have this huge below the skin hemorrhage and bleed out. What happens is the internal wall of the carotid artery tears, and the body in its natural state of wanting to repair that tear, a blood clot develops. Platelets bind together, and not only that, that little, and I'm kind of using my hands as the internal wall of the artery. When it tears and circulation is passing through the carotid artery, this torn material creates a little eddy, a little whirlpool of blood. And those platelets bind up even more, and the body's trying to repair this damage, and it's creating a pool. So a blood clot forms. And again, this is something you won't feel. And at any time, portions or all of that blood clot can break loose and cause a fatal stroke or a stroke that's going to cause some significant memory or body dysfunction. Sometimes they're called ischemic strokes, which is kind of strokes that they don't have a known cause because it's been days later or months later that and that's the scary part. A person can suffer these strokes weeks or months after the strangulation occurred, and the doctors don't have any idea what caused it because there's been no disclosure or no investigation as to what happened previously.
I really want people to hear that. That is doesn't seem like it's that crazy that that amount of pressure might do something to your carotid artery. My husband was watching football at our neighbor's house and he choked him out. And my husband almost passed out. He was like, it was like he was joking around. And I was like, how is that even possible? So these things don't take a lot. You're talking very delicate area around here.
Another one is we have a group of nerve bundles that run down through from our brain to the core of our body. That's our vagus nerve. And so overstimulation of that vagus nerve can cause a heart attack. It can cause different arrhythmias in our heart and cause a heart attack. Another one that can happen is what's called thyroid storm. So our thyroid sits right here. It's a gland that produces a lot of necessary hormones in our body, and overstimulation of that thyroid gland can cause many different types of hormones to be released into the body that can affect our heart rate. It can affect our body temperature. I've had some emergency room doctors that specialize in this have strangulation victims come into the hospital with 106 fever. There's no bacterial issue, there's no viral issue, but they start measuring the thyroids and the thyroid hormones that I'm oversimplifying here that control our body temperature are causing the body temperature to go off the chart into a critical area that could cause death. Less acute and less dangerous, but long term, I've got individuals that I know that have had permanent vision loss or permanent vision problems from a strangulation incident that happened 30 years ago, permanent swallowing problems, permanent breathing problems. And then we haven't even touched in on the cognitive issues. We have people that have suffered both, not just the trauma of the event, but their brain has actually been altered due to loss of consciousness. So repeated acts of strangulation leading to unconsciousness have led to progressive brain damage that has led to a different type of characteristics in their behavior, different diagnosed psychosis.
Is that what happened to that's like kind of what happens in when you become unconscious, like what happened to Aaron Hernandez?
Mhm.
He became like I mean, I'm not saying suggesting people are all going to become killers, but that was his issue is that they figured out that his brain from all of the loss of consciousness over the years of football created like Swiss cheese in his brain essentially.
We have short-term responses to stress and we have long-term responses to stress. And again, some of that is due truly to the traumatic event. But when we understand that the brain is the number one organ in our body affected by strangulation, it makes perfect sense, and the research bears out that progressive brain damage will alter a person's characteristics of their behavior, their understanding, and their cognitive abilities. And so someone that, that their friends and family may say, "Oh, they were just so nice and just, just the sweetest person that we knew 5 years ago," is now forgetful, aggressive, anxious, paranoid. It covers such a huge, and I'm just touching the surface. It has some very bad effects on not just our mind but our body.
This is so interesting because even when you think about all of the children, when we talk about the Shez, what's that called? That when they're the ACEs
Yes,
test?
ACE, aggressive
Mhm.
childhood experience. Oh, excuse me,
It's
adverse childhood experiences.
adverse childhood
Mhm.
Yeah,
experiences.
I
Yeah.
mean, you think about kids who, I mean, yes, we know that there are parents, guardians who are like, choking their kid to get them to like do whatever. And you think that in the long term, I mean, obviously there's a lot of trauma there, but I mean, even just if you get over, like you said, the trauma, it's the long-term impact of these adverse childhood events. Even on a playground, like kids messing around, it is scary how your brain will have telltale signs down the road. Is strangulation something that every police officer or medical person would ask a domestic violence? If somebody comes in for domestic violence, as we wrap this up, is strangulation something that is routinely asked about?
I would say not as much as it should be. Even in states that have implemented statutes and protocols, we still find that there is a deficiency sometimes in broaching that subject, either due to misinformation or someone not feeling qualified to engage someone in that conversation. With our efforts here in South Carolina, that's something that I am trying to incorporate into our statute is what's called mandatory notification. At least that law enforcement would advise victims of the dangers of non-fatal strangulation and advise them to seek medical treatment. We can't force them to go, but again, with all the different professions that may intersect with any type of strangulation victim, I think that type of conversation needs to be brought up. I don't think it happens as much as it should, even in states that have very established and well-established protocols.
It's part of some CEU training for domestic violence, but a little bit. And there's been so much new information that I don't know if it's caught up yet, you know, new in terms of a better understanding of what happens and what it might look like and where things might show up. So, because a lot of this is new to me, and I have to take a CEU class every 2 years on child abuse, domestic violence, all those things. So, very interesting. How did you say again that you got interested in this? Like, how did you start seeing a lot of this?
Well, in the early years of my law enforcement career, strangulation was talked about, but what we were told back then was anecdotal. There wasn't any solid research, and what we were told essentially was look for marks on the neck and petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and that'll tell you if someone's been strangled. And if it's not there, it didn't happen. That was bad training.
Yeah.
But that's what was known or hypothesized at the time. So when you accompany the lack of external injuries and you pair that with a strangulation victim who commonly will not remember what happened, they're automatically discredited. I don't see anything, and you can't tell me a linear story. So I guess it didn't happen. And no harm, no foul here. So as I progressed through my law enforcement career specializing in domestic violence, I had an opportunity to attend a strangulation advanced training class. And it surprised me that it was 4 days long. And I'm like, 4 days to talk about something like this? I kind of thought I already knew it. And what I came to realize very, very quickly is I didn't know anything. What I knew up to that point didn't really serve me well, and it served the people that I was serving even less because I wasn't getting it. I wasn't seeing it. And I had this stark realization literally within the first couple hours of a 4 day class that I immediately started to recall cases I had already dealt with where I did not know what I was seeing, and I did not understand what I was hearing. And I felt guilty. I felt guilty that I did not know what I needed to know, and these people were likely these women and these children, these other people were likely left in a situation to suffer more, or if I even got them out of that situation, they did not get the necessary care after the fact that they needed. And that is really what pushed me into I've got to know everything about this that I can to into every degree and every facet that I can so that people aren't those out there that care and those that are in a job that they should care or a job whether they care or not, they should be doing the right thing to take this to people that need to know because it is missed all too often and the care that they need is not provided. And I'm a law enforcement officer, I'm not a clinician, but I've taught plenty of clinicians, and people always are like, well, Brian must be all about locking up people. Well, I'm certainly about offender accountability, don't get me wrong, but the number one most important thing is that patient care and patient triage, taking care of our patient, taking care of our victim first, and then we can worry about accountability. That's what warrants are for, and that's what investigations are for. Let's get that person taken care of first, get them safe, get them treated, and then we can move on to the accountability factor of the people that use this in a criminal way.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's amazing. So grateful.
You know what it actually makes me think? You're talking about a time when you learned and there wasn't the language, there wasn't the understanding, and in some ways, to broach into our new topic, there's not a lot of understanding around the sexual strangulation. From what I've read, actually, people always say this is part of like the BDSM community, and it actually was not common at all in the BDSM community. This is really something that is driven by porn consumption. It's something that's just used now it's in memes, it's on Twitter, it's on all of these places. But the fact of the matter is, we are as ignorant about what sexual strangulation will do as you were back in 1995 when you became a police officer and you learned to look for bruising and hemorrhaging.
Correct.
There's just ignorance around it, and people who need to know, like you're saying, these are people who are put in care of young people. If we're going to talk about like, perhaps like the university health center. There are
Mhm,
things they should probably be looking for. Those that are in mental health, at the university level or even at a high school level, they should know certain things. They should be asking things about sexual behaviors and letting them know, hey, there are some long-term things you should be concerned about. And it's not as carefree and easy as you're thinking that it is, because pornography says everything is easy and looks like this, and it's all a fallacy.
mhm,
It's scary because there's so many kids who are going to have to go through this. There's so many people who are going to deal with, whether it's I believe one of the long-term effects is also depression, right? Isn't that
mhm,
part of it?
yeah,
So you have these kids who are already struggling with mental health. Then they're going to have, be strangled, sexually strangled, and they're going to deal with long-term thyroid storms, all of these kind of things, and potentially a stroke, greater issues than they're already dealing with. And we don't have the language, we don't have the understanding around sexual strangulation like you didn't and law enforcement
mhm,
didn't 30 years ago,
mhm.
20 years ago.
Yeah, there was a training class that I did, I can't remember, at least 5 or 6 years ago, if not more, and it was for an association of school nurses from all across the state. And in that particular setting, again, it was school nurses, and these were private school and public school nurses that, served their students. And we were talking about pediatric strangulation within the realm of, child abuse at home or fights on the playground or assaults at the school. And there must have been about 400 nurses there. And after the presentation was over, I mean, I was getting stopped in the hallway and their minds were completely blown. They were like, "You know what? I've never thought about this." But just like me, they started to relate stories of, "I had this kid in class and I saw this and I saw this and I heard this and now I know what it was. I didn't know what it was." They felt guilty too. And now when we add this component of the sex play or the sexual activity and how soon and how young people are getting involved in this. Yeah, in our our collegiate settings, our high schools, our middle schools, everyone in that realm of responsibility and care needs to have an awareness of it, of this issue.
They have to have an understanding. Parents have to understand it. Everybody has to understand and at least be having the conversations about this is actually a very dangerous activity.
And a lot of the nurses, they were asking questions about the choking game or the pass
Mhm.
out game that
Yes.
kids play. And so they're
Yes.
talking about it more like in a playground type of atmosphere. But then, like you said, to the degree that y'all focus on in the intimate setting, you know, that was something that wasn't even on the radar. And quite frankly, it wasn't even on my radar at that point. And like I said, that was, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. But
Yeah.
now with the proliferation, I mean, we know pornography's been out there for ages and it's just getting bigger and bigger every day. But this issue of, strangulation somehow being not that dangerous and normalized, it's just exponentially just growing like crazy.
And how irresponsible that there are women's magazines talking about safe ways to strangle. And I think that's what Dr. Shez was talking about earlier. I mean, that is so irresponsible. One was I think it was in Women's Health. I was like, this is mind
That
blowing.
is so scary.
Women's
So
Health
scary.
magazine. This is not even Cosmopolitan where you're like, okay, maybe it's a little edgy. This was like a
Mm.
women's health magazine.
This is how I address that issue. When people say, "Well, strangulation is not that dangerous," I say, "Okay, if it's not that dangerous, let me give you this scenario. If someone had their hands or ligature around your neck and they were making an attempt or actually depriving your brain of the necessary oxygen for you to be alive, would you have the right to use deadly force to save your life?" I've never had anybody say no. I said, "Okay, then that is you telling me you realize how dangerous it is. I've just changed a scenario or a thought within you that now has caused you to rethink it." Another one that I say is this is more for prosecutors, but it works for everybody. You're walking down the street, someone fires a gun at you from across the street, and we'll stipulate that no bullet hits you. You suffer no physical injury whatsoever. I mean, traumatic injury from the event, yes, but no physical injury. The person could be charged with attempted murder or aggravated assault. And then I say, well, what about someone who's strangled or quote choked? And we can talk about that. That choke terminology drives me crazy. We can get into that. But choke. And they're like, well, what charge them with? And I say, okay, but here's the deal. The person who's being strangled actually is at more risk of death and serious injury than you getting shot at. And then when, of course, I lay out the causes and the reasons why that's true, they're like, I never thought about that. And here's the last thing to think about. Your body, your brain does not know what is against your wishes or with your consent. Your body is still going to react. Your brain and your body, your physiology are still going to react the same way when there's an oxygen deprived brain and pressure, whether it's criminal and against your wishes or consensual. So our mixed martial arts fighters, they sign contracts to go into a ring, mutual combat, and go after each other. And they use these same holds on each other, the rear naked choke, the lateral vascular neck restraint. It's all strangulation. And they also suffer the ill effects of that mechanism of depriving the brain and the body of its needed oxygen. So even in the consensual setting of intimacy, the body doesn't know. The body just responds or doesn't respond to a certain point when injury occurs. So the results are the same. There is no safe strangulation. It just does not exist. And for someone to say or use that terminology or explanation, they truly don't understand the dangers.
Well, okay, so you know a lot about strangulation. Do you think with all that you know that you could safely strangle someone?
Oh no. Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
You probably wouldn't even try if somebody said it to you knowing all that you know.
Oh no, absolutely. And I've had people come up to me after presentations. Usually my presentations are usually a multidisciplinary setting of a mix of prosecutors, victim advocates, law enforcement, sometimes victim survivors. I've had mixed martial arts practitioners walk up to me and go, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, what do you mean? Oh, I've been practicing mixed martial arts for 20 years and I've probably been unconscious 20 times. I'm fine. I'm like, no, you're not. Because every moment that your brain is unconscious, hundreds of millions of neurons and synapses have died in your brain.
Mhm.
It just hasn't gotten severe yet for you to recognize that your brain is in a dysfunction. That's why you say you're okay. Now, 20 years from now, it may not be so. And I've had people who've practiced this type of sex play in their life tell me the same thing. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm perfectly fine. And then I ask them a few questions about, have you experienced this? Have you experienced this? Yeah. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, then you're not fine. Thought you were, but you're not. And hopefully the light bulb goes off.
Yeah. It's all about awareness, and especially with young people who aren't talking about this stuff or researching it or understanding. Maybe they think they're researching a little bit, but they're not hearing what all the things that you said. So, are you talking at schools and high schools and colleges as well?
I'm trying to. I've definitely
Okay.
been trying to network as much as I can. I do have a network of individuals in the different educational settings with some of the nursing schools and some of the school settings. As of right now, even though those offers have been made, I haven't had a whole lot of response.
Mm.
Not really sure why that is. But again, I hate to keep bringing my state up, but I think and hopefully we pass this legislation, it will necessitate people becoming informed and should necessitate more active educational methods and opportunities across many, many disciplines. I think just a lot of people are operating in ignorance, quite
Right.
frankly.
Right.
And I think it's going to take more people speaking more frequently with more authority than what we currently have in our state. I can't speak for other states. I know California, and they do seem to do a really good job from what I hear. That's kind of where this all originated. They've got 20 years ahead of us.
Mm. Wow.
Um, so,
Can you
but
describe the new legislation that's up for being approved?
yeah. So just a quick background: we have introduced a bill here in my state for the last 3 legislative sessions. Our legislative sessions are 2 years long, so we've gone 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, and no passage of this bill. We recently had some more of our legislators introduce the bill for this legislative session that would specifically define what strangulation is, strangulation and suffocation, and provides a felony penalty of 3 years in prison for strangulation. There is an aggravating factor that if there is a prior conviction of strangulation or a violation of an order of protection or restraining order, protective order when that strangulation occurs, that would provide an aggravating circumstance to provide for a 10-year felony. Now, this particular bill, the wording in it actually educates the reader. So if people haven't gone through a formal training, it actually explains what strangulation is by definition, to at least give them a base knowledge of what occurred and what potential dangers there are and some of the signs, symptoms, and indicators. We wanted to make a standalone statute because of a few different factors. Not every state in the country, the 49 other states who have legislation, not all of them have done a standalone. Some of them added language under some existing assault, attempted murder statutes, which is fine. But we chose, and what my preference has been, is a standalone, and this is why. When I was on the governor's domestic violence task force, Governor Haley at the time, back in 2015, when she asked me to serve, our research showed in South Carolina that we are very inconsistent with terminology, we are very inconsistent with understanding, and we are very inconsistent with the ability of all of our systems to speak with each other and kind of cross-reference and commingle data. And what we found out is that tracking strangulation or instances of strangulation was incredibly problematic because we had no specific code. We had no specific understanding of what strangulation and suffocation was. And so we had all kinds of statutes being used, all kinds of terminology, and that caused data and information to get just lost in the mix. We couldn't find it. So one reason we wanted to make it standalone was to, quite frankly, simplify the legislative language. We didn't want to have to retroactively go back and rewrite 25, 30 different statutes under vulnerable adult statutes and child abuse and assault. But also we wanted to give it that specific attention to make it trackable, because when we have a specific statute, then it becomes much easier to track. And any legislation needs to have the ability to gauge its effectiveness and whether it needs to be changed or improved. And the only way to do that is to secure it through data. The other thing about it is, and I'm not naive to understand that somebody is probably going to get charged when this law passes one day, and it will. I know it will at some point. If they're charged under strangulation, hopefully they're prosecuted for strangulation, but I also know there's probably going to be some plea agreements to maybe a lesser charge. But the good thing about it is we will still know the original charging statute. It won't be like, poof, gone. We'll know in the records, within the court records and the law enforcement records, that they were charged under the strangulation statute, but pled to, I don't know, domestic violence of a high and aggravated nature. So we still have something that's trackable.
Yeah, and as you had said before, it's the incident of them doing something harmful. Actually, I think it was like either killing police officers, but also the chance of that mass shooters aren't mass shooters. I think you had told me that like a lot of them had also been in their history arrested for or charged with domestic violence strangulation.
Right. So when we say strangulation is the number one indicator of homicide, what most people go to and what they think about is that targeted strangulation victim,
Right.
predominantly in the domestic violence relationship. But what we have to understand about homicides within domestic violence is there are a lot of people who, because they don't meet a household member definition, are not included in those statistics. Men, women, children, mothers, fathers, bystanders who have intervened in that domestic situation and gotten killed, they're not counted in those domestic violence homicides because they weren't household members or intimate partners. Then when we look at assaults on law enforcement officers or critical incidents of law enforcement officers, Casey Gwynn, who's one of the CEOs and co-directors of the Institute on Strangulation Prevention, they started doing some research years ago out of the Treasure Valley, Idaho, where it showed that 80% of critical incidents, and that what that meant was when officers were shot or got shot, 80% involved those with a history of domestic violence, and 30% of those offenders had trackable histories of strangulation. So what that tells our law enforcement officers is, and really anybody, is that when you encounter someone who uses strangulation as a form of assault, you're looking at a future killer. And then to what you also said, to go on further about what does data show us about mass shooters? Well, not every mass shooter has a history of strangulation, but some of them do. A couple of them, one of the most prominent ones is the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida, with Omar Mateen. We killed over 60 people in what happened to be a gay nightclub. People package that as, well, he was sympathetic to ISIS. He did not like the LBGT community. And that may be true, but when you look at his previous background, he had a pattern of strangling his intimate partners. We had, I think it's Devin Kelly. I might have got his name wrong, but in a church in Texas, he killed 26 people in a church in Texas. He went there to kill his wife. She wasn't there. He ended up killing his mother-in-law. Well, his background was he used to be in the Air Force. He was dishonorably discharged for assaulting his wife in a domestic violence charge under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and strangling his son. He was dishonorably discharged. The Air Force did not report that conviction to the FBI database, and he was able to buy a firearm and go hunt for his wife and kill 26 people. And then we had the Miami airport shooting. I can't remember. I think that gentleman's name was Santiago Esteban, maybe. But he was a resident of Alaska. He gets on a plane from Alaska to Miami, Florida. The only thing he brought with him was a case with a firearm and a case of ammunition. They were stored separately. They were stored and put checked baggage, just like the TSA requires. The problem is that when he got off the airplane, he retrieved his bags off the carousel, went into the bathroom, loaded up the gun, and killed 5 people. Well, his background was strangling his intimate partners when he was a resident of Alaska. He was actually charged with a domestic violence charge involving that, but was allowed to plead to a misdemeanor, which kept him off the radar for the firearm prohibitions, what we call the Laudenberg Amendment that was passed many years ago. And those are just 3. There's many, many more. So I can't say that every mass shooter, but what we're talking about is, what is the mindset of someone who's going to use strangulation as a form of assault? And what it's pointing to is they have the mindset and the behavioral characteristics of a future killer.
I think that that is so important, especially. So we had a story of one of our podcast guests whose boyfriend, it started out with him being like jealous, whatever, and it escalated to one night he literally strangled her. It was not a sexual strangulation. He literally strangled her. And when I was doing this research and after talking to you, I thought, if every woman or partner of a person who strangled them in a violent or aggressive situation, I'm not saying sexual strangulation, obviously we have still a lot of research to do in that area. But if your partner strangles you, the chance that they are a very violent offender is pretty high. And I think that that's something that people like, when you can make, oh, well, he pushed me. And so maybe I'm not suggesting any domestic violence is okay, but I feel like from what my research, which was just, doing this and talking to you, but I feel like strangulation seems to indicate something a lot more aggressive than somebody who needs to take a, whatever, what are they, anger management class. That seems to be somebody who has a real potential for murder, hurting, killing someone in the future.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, and this is just my opinion here, but I think a lot of them, it just demonstrates their lack of empathy and care for another individual. And sometimes they want to operate in ignorance. Well, I didn't know it was dangerous. I mean, really? You didn't know it was dangerous? So, so you didn't understand that a person that doesn't have the needed oxygen can die?
Mm.
I mean, everybody inherently knows that. I mean, you take a baby, you can't even articulate their words. And if you were to hold them underwater, I mean, our bodies know that we need air and we struggle for breath. Even wild animals struggle for breath because our brains and our medical physiological parts of our body operate that way. It is necessary for life. And so there's this innate understanding in these built-in autonomic systems of our body that crave and struggle for breath. And so for someone to operate in ignorance, well, I didn't know that, I was dangerous. Oh, really? So hold your breath for the next 10 minutes and tell me what happens to you.
One of the things that you said was that some of the things you're working on are awareness, detection, and treatment.
Mhm,
So I'm curious about what the treatment
mhm.
protocol is.
So with treatment, let me specify, the treatment is medical emergency triage. Okay. Now I also say in most of my trainings that, again, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a psychologist. I do have undergrad in psychology and sociology, but I'm not a practitioner in those areas. I got those undergrads because I knew I was going to be dealing with people as a law enforcement officer. I wanted to understand people better and how they work. So I always emphasize that the medical emergency triage is first, but we also need aftercare for people's emotions and their psyche and their well-being. And the practitioners that are specifically trained in those areas need to take up that cause. And that's where those people need to be. But with treatment, and what I mean by that is statistics tell us that if that only about 3% of strangled victims get medical care. So if we make it simple, out of 100 people who we could substantiate and verify were strangled, only about 3% ever get to the hospital. But even less than that get the necessary exams and imaging that they need. And so part of that treatment protocol that I teach about is intake and advisement to the hospital, tapping into the resource of the forensic nurse examiner or the forensic nurse examiner. They're kind of used interchangeably because we would expect, or the public should expect, that the emergency room doctor or the nurses in the emergency room would know about this. And the fact is, they don't. It's not part of their regular curriculum. It's not part of their certification requirements to have specific training on strangulation. So when we get to the hospital, it's that advising to the medical professionals, this person has been strangled, I've been strangled, or the common terminology or vernacular is choked, even though that's medically and technically wrong. But that's what the medical professionals would understand. But they also need to understand their limitations, and people need to ask for the forensic nurse examiner or the sexual assault nurse examiner as a specialist who knows how to do specific exams, not just for the medical triage and emergency care, but they are also very critical to the evidence gathering team of any potential criminal charges. So we tap into that, and the medical professionals that are there, namely the doctors, they're the ones that have the ability to order exams, and they need to be ordering exams like MRIs. MRIs are one of the suggested exams. Another one are CTAs, which is a CT scan with an angiogram. That's where they put a dye into the system and they can see the structures of the veins and the arteries to see if they're intact, because an X-ray won't show all this. I can't tell you how many times individuals that I've known have gone to the hospital and they've ordered an X-ray. X-ray is not going to show anything. We need these more detailed imaging techniques, and it even goes so far as, some of the doctors actually needing to use a laryngoscope and looking down the throat, into the throat, and looking in the ears and looking at the retinas in the back of the eye, imaging the brain for petechial hemorrhages and brain scans and clotting. And so that's what I mean by treatment, is making sure that people get to the hospital, but making sure that the hospital and the professionals there provide the emergency medical care to stabilize these victims so that they don't die and we limit those long-term complications. But certainly the psychological and behavioral aspect of trauma and care to those individuals is a follow-up that should be absolutely called upon in that time after the hospital and in the weeks and months down the road.
That's really helpful to know those tests of what is so not standard. That's not going to happen without somebody pushing it.
Mhm.
So I want to read both of you something that I just read. It said, in a study published by researchers in the US, 81.7% of more than 4,200 college students surveyed had practiced sexual strangulation. They reported experiencing pleasurable sensations and euphoria. So 81.7 reported that they enjoyed it. I mean, euphoria is a lot
Yep.
different than dysphoria. Pleasurable sensations, which are caused by lack of oxygen to the brain in response to being choked. Some 43% reported a head rush, which I'm going to ask you about, Brian, and again felt that the same amount felt as though they could not breathe. About 2 out of 5 respondents had experienced difficulty swallowing and an inability to speak. 15% found bruising on their neck, and 3% lost consciousness as a result of being choked. That is a whole lot of exactly what you're talking about in domestic violence happening in sexual situations.
Correct.
4,200 students. 4,200 students.
Yes.
That is so
81%.
frightening. That is
That
so
is
frightening.
so frightening. I'm just really hoping that like the work you do leaches into the world of sexual strangulation so that people are aware and know to look, because these kids could show up at the health center, like I said before. And also,
Mhm.
doesn't it sort of numb these young people to when someone is violent with them? I think that was Dr. Shez's point earlier in our this discussion, is that it really confuses the brain. Where does the line between what is acceptable, which I would argue, should it be
None.
acceptable at all,
Yeah.
to what is not acceptable and what is downright dangerous and a sign of somebody who could have psychopathic like potential.
Mhm.
And I'm not suggesting that every person that tries it, I do think they've all been indoctrinated by pornography, but it is scary because how do you know when you're going to meet somebody who is more psychotic and it's going to go that direction?
Yeah. So let me make a connection here. So we talked a little bit earlier about the choking game, some young people engage in. Well, the reason that they engage in that choking game initially usually is peer pressure. Somebody telling them about it, and it's this kind of mysterious thing. And then what you find from some of them is exactly what you related here, that, well, it felt good. I had this euphoria. And some of them justify it to their teachers and their parents by saying, well, I'm not using drugs or alcohol. It's a safe way for me to feel good and get high. It's not dangerous. But that euphoric feeling comes from brain cell death and the brain being flooded with oxygenated blood after it's been deprived of blood. So that euphoric feeling, although it feels good, is an indicator of damage. And and to the respect of this erotic asphyxiation, that is where some people relate to this heightened sexual pleasure. Is it took me to another level I've never been before, and it feels good, so it must be okay. And there are those who openly choose and ask to be strangled to reach that sexual climax that they're looking for. This is both with men and women. But we also know that not so much on the receiving, but on the application side, the person applying the strangulation, that some of those individuals, well, what kind of thrill do they get out of it? And usually for them, it is not a physiological arousal; it's a psychological arousal that ties into their pleasure center of having power and authority over another individual, or holding someone's life in their hands, or for people that have criminal tendencies and are criminally insane, and truly, I mean, look at a lot of our serial killers. I mean, a lot of them had some basis in sexual gratification that didn't deal with the climax physiologically, but psychologically, of the thrill. And that's what we saw in one of our cases here in South Carolina with a homicide that we just had probably 2 months ago. Was a guy who had a very clear and distinct pattern of utilizing strangulation with intimacy. And it ultimately has led to a charge of homicide.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing is what people don't realize, to your point, obviously that's an extreme, that this murder happened, but who
Mhm,
knows when you are chasing that dopamine high. And honestly, that's what you're saying too in the other way. And
mhm,
it's like this is the escalation that is happening with people, is like they're looking for this thing. I mean, if you look all the way back as far as to Albert Kinsey, or Alfred Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, but I can't remember what his first name is, Alfred. He used to put pins in the end of his penis. I think he circumcised himself because he needed that stimulation, because that was like the next level. And so this stuff happens with people. It's a leveling up. And
mhm,
I mean, I can only say, as somebody who very much so cares about young people, who very much so, I've said for years, I want people to have healthy sex lives from today until they're 99, until they die. And you don't get there by pushing extremes. Pushing
mhm,
extremes has a natural and very bad die off. death, or it's, mangling your penis or whatever. Like, you can't just keep pushing. And so I would question if that's the only way that you're enjoying sex and you're young. I mean, this is young. These are young people.
Mhm.
This is not a good trajectory, I don't think.
No, not at all. It's a very dangerous trend that's I think's been developing for years, but now becoming more to the surface just because of how accepted it seems to be and how prolific it's seeming to have become.
Well, in pornography, of course.
Mhm.
I'm so grateful for all of this. Shez, do you wanna say anything?
I think this was a wonderful education. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you so much, Brian. And it's things that I will, of course, share with parents and clients. And I think that's the key is education, because I think there's a lot of people in the dark, so to speak, about these issues and the aftermath and the seriousness of it. And it's grown in this silence, and so we have to break out of that silence. So what you're doing is amazing. So loved hearing why you got into this. And I hope you relieve yourself of the guilt, because the numbers of people that you're impacting now is definitely beyond what, those few stories that you may ruminate about. And I do the same thing, but it's really important that we can let that go and know that the path forward is helping. So thank you so much.
Well, no, it's my pleasure, and, I tell people I'm kind of, what I call a voice alone in the wilderness here, because 'cause
Mm-mm.
I'm one of the few people I'm the only one here that does training on this on a regular basis. I mean, other states it's different. I got many practitioners and many trainers, but I don't want it to just be me. I want to have a whole, I want to have many, many people to be
Yeah.
to this level. And because I mean, knowledge is power. Sometimes I'm critical of law enforcement, I'm critical of our medical professionals. You don't get it, but then I also have to ask myself, do they know? If it's one thing to know and ignore, but back in my early days, I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, so that's what I'm trying to fix. I want people to be in that awareness. And you mentioned earlier about public service announcements. That's something that I am pushing for as well. I mean, every state generally does a pretty good job of highlighting Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October and human trafficking and drunk driving awareness. But I always tell people, when was the last time you saw a public service announcement about domestic violence and it wasn't in the month of October? When was the last time you saw a public service announcement about elder abuse, child abuse, strangulation? We just don't talk about it enough. You go to countries like New Zealand, United Kingdom, some of the other countries around the world that I've spoken with, and you look at some of their commercials, they've got PSAs appearing on network primetime TV when millions of people are watching.
We need that.
I've been saying this for forever. They are so much ahead of us as far as like understanding about how porn impacts
Mhm.
what is happening with, peer to peer sexual violence. They are so much ahead of us. If people want to support the work that you do, Brian, where can they find you?
Well, the best way right now is the only platform that I'm using is my Facebook group page called Strangulation Law for SC, Strangulation Law for South Carolina, but it's abbreviated SC. It is a private group page. I did have it public, but in the interest of protecting people's identities and some of the things that they say, I changed it to a private Facebook page, but people can, ask to be on there. What that page does, and this is just specific to South Carolina, it provides education, statistics, videos, news stories, just a plethora of topics and issues surrounding non-fatal strangulation and the need to pass a statute here in South Carolina. I'm not really on any of the other social networking platforms, but yeah, that Facebook page. And again, that provides legislative updates too. I've got documents on there that you can download, reports that I did for our legislature, statistical research, things that can be downloaded and shared, awareness posters, awareness pamphlets that people can pass out to their friends or a person in need. Free strangulation. Let me just say this: if anybody wants to get free non-fatal strangulation training. If you go onto your search engine and you type in free non-fatal strangulation or something to that effect, you will see a link come up from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And that link, when you click on it, will take you to a little portal on their website, and you will see a law enforcement officer inside of a little window. But this is not just for law enforcement officers. Anybody can take this. It is a 20 to 25-minute, fully interactive video training that takes you step by step on the basics that you need to know about non-fatal strangulation. And at the end, you can take a little post test and get a little free certificate as well. It's absolutely free. Another thing that I would say is if anyone feels that they are not aware enough or they're not good enough to have an educated conversation with someone who's been strangled and the need to seek immediate medical care. If you go on YouTube, there's a video called Nurse Joanne and Strangulation. This nurse was filmed in a way as if she was talking to a strangulation survivor. She is, in fact, a forensic nurse, a sexual assault nurse examiner. And what's good about that video is if you have someone who's been strangled or indicated to be strangled, again, you don't feel like you have the information to be able to explain why they need to go to the emergency room. Pop that up on your phone, pop that up on your tablet, and let them watch that little 5-minute video. And she does a fantastic job of talking to a patient as to why they need to come to the hospital and what needs to be done. Absolutely phenomenal video.
We'll link that in our show notes so that people can find it. That's amazing. Thank you so much for all of that information. Thank you for the work that you do.
Yeah, this is life-saving work. I mean, truly life-saving. So, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Really loved hearing all this.
And again, it's my pleasure. I
Unfortunately.
thank you for your interest in this area. I think that you and others are really taking the lead and bringing this to the forefront of people's mind, to the forefront of societal recognition. Because right now it's still kind of on the fringes per se, even though other states have statutes. But we're moving every day to a bigger and more broad understanding of truly how serious this is.
And I will say, even though you say South Carolina is behind, I do think you also told me that USC and the Strangulation Institute or whatever don't all federal prosecutors or something go through that training that they do there?
Right. So what you're referring to is that here in South Carolina, we have the University of South Carolina. It's one of our big state colleges. And we have something here called the National Advocacy Center. That was actually funded through the federal government through one of our former senators who was able to build a specific school to train federal prosecutors and federal law enforcement officers about many, many different types of things related to their job. But usually, one time a year, the National Advocacy Center hosts a 4-day advanced class for those federal prosecutors and those federal agents to at least bring this level of understanding into their world and to utilize it within the federal system. Again, it's been my efforts to try to do that here on the state level for our for South Carolinians.
So I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything in that. And that's great information to know. And Brian, we will stay in touch.
For sure, absolutely.
Take care.
Thank you.
You too. See you.
Bye.